Hey there, students. Tom Richey here with Marco Learning, and in this video, I'm going to give you an overview of Unit 8 in the AP European History course, which is focusing on 20th century global conflicts, basically the era of the world wars. So as we go into this, we need to think about the backdrop here of the Second Industrial Revolution and this unprecedented European dominance that we've seen and the technological advancements of the Second Industrial Revolution with chemicals and airplanes and new forms of transportation, the internal combustion engine. And then the Western world is going to use all of this stuff for people to kill each other. And so let's go into the causes of World War I. Now, first of all, we typically show this in terms of the main causes: militarism, alliances, imperialism, and nationalism. Militarism being the Anglo-German arms race. And we see here these nations striving for the best military technology. Now, the Dreadnought, okay, now this was, of course, the HMS Dreadnought, which was a battleship that eclipsed all other battleships that had been created up to that point. And the Dreadnought was so superior to all of the others that it made everything start over. That it's not about how many ships you have, it's about how many dreadnoughts you have. So we see before World War I, we see that there is this arms race, this military buildup. Now also the alliance system. Now, of course, the alliance system was put together by Otto von Bismarck in order to prevent war, and it did so until it didn't. Just like nuclear weapons have been great for peace, until someone decides to detonate one, then that's going to be a different story. So the alliance system is seen as one of these causes of World War I. Imperialism, which of course this competition for empire across the globe, and let's not forget internal European imperialism, most notably the Austrian Empire, because we have all of these different ethnic groups being dominated by this one empire in an age of nationalism. And that's where all of this is going to start with the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. And that's where you have these Serbian nationalists from the Black Hand who assassinate Franz Ferdinand and start this chain of events that leads to a war that people were really kind of preparing to have anyway. Now, as far as the military technologies of World War I, we want to note that these offensive technologies, such as machine guns and poison gas, that these are, so deadly that really people are starting to just hide from them. So you see this trench warfare, which is really just kind of a stalemate, that you will have a battle that lasts for months and the battle lines only move a couple of miles. So it's not a war where as much is happening as other wars that you're used to. Now, another thing about World War I is we see the U.S. intervention in a European war for the first time. And of course, in the 20th century, we will see the United States play a more prominent role in European and Western history in general. Moving on now to the Russian Revolution, which is something that is very difficult to explain in brief, but let's go ahead and take a quick look. Now, first of all, we want to differentiate between the 1905 revolution and the 1917 revolution. Before 1905, Russia was, of course, an autocracy led by the Tsar and his administration. In 1905, after the tragedy of Bloody Sunday, which was an uprising that was put down quite violently, Nicholas II released the October Manifesto. Now, let's not confuse that with the October Revolution, but in the October Manifesto, Nicholas II said that we will have a constitution, we will have a Duma, a representative body. Now, of course, the Tsar still had a full veto, and that system really didn't end up working that well. And the main Russian Revolution is in 1917. Now, first of all, you have the collapse of the Tsarist government during World War I, which leads to the provisional government government that never quite got on its feet and was overthrown by Vladimir Lenin and his Bolshevik faction of communists. Now, we want to take a moment to talk about Leninism. How does Leninism compare to Marxism? Leninism is an updated form of Marxism. Now, like Marxism, Leninism says that there is going to be a violent revolution that is going to result in the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the ascendance of the proletariat in a communist society. Now, the difference is that while Marx believed that the working class would construct its own sense of class consciousness, Lenin did not believe that to be the case. Lenin believed that there needs to be a revolutionary vanguard. There needs to be a group of people who are more educated, people like Lenin, how convenient, who are going to give the working class a sense of class consciousness. And so when Lenin took over, it resembled less of this communist society that Marx saw and more of a dictatorship. This was a top-down model, and it continued to be. Now, at first, Lenin tried to implement what was known as war communism, that we're going to create a completely communist society. He backed away from that when he saw it wasn't working, and he responded with the NEP, New Economic Policy, which allowed forms of petty capitalism, that the state still controlled major industries, but that there could be small-time capitalists that are working on, just things like if you have a YouTube channel or something like that. Maybe if that would have been around, you could have done something like that, but you are not going to run a major manufacturing facility or something like that. That'll be under the state. But the NEP allowed for what's called petty capitalism. Now, of course, once Stalin took over, the NEP was rescinded and replaced by Stalin's collective farming and 5-year plans. Now, we took a little aside for the Russian Revolution, which began in 1917, but let's not forget about World War I, which ended in 1918 with the armistice in November, on November 11th at the 11th hour, and it was followed by the Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles. Now, Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States, was very active at this conference, and his brainchild, the League of Nations, was created, which has become a running joke and a source of many memes because it really didn't last. Because Wilson's idea of a peace without victory was overruled by Britain and especially by France, who were really more concerned about Germany admitting their war guilt, that Germany started this war and Germany owes reparations to the Allies. So the Treaty of Versailles produced both the League of Nations and saddled Germany with this war guilt, with this humiliation and these reparations that they really were not in a position to afford, that was going to go on and have a hand in wrecking the European economy later on in the 1920s. Now, the Ottoman Empire was also divided up as a result of World War I, and we see that the Turks adopted the Western alphabet and a few other things, and Turkey is really kind of part of Europe a little bit, just a little bit of it, but really not part of Europe at the same time. I made slight mention of the economic crisis that was created by the Treaty of Versailles. Today, Germany is the #1 economy in Europe. And of course, before World War I, Germany had actually surpassed Great Britain as the #1 manufacturer in Europe. And of course, World War I crippled this economy, and the Treaty of Versailles certainly didn't help. By the late 1920s, 1929 to be exact, you have the onset of the Great Depression, which was felt around the world, including in the United States, where we emphasize the Great Depression a little bit more in our treatment of United States history. But here, suffice to say that before the Great Depression, even though Germany had some economic problems, parties such as the Nazis didn't really become that popular, but it was the Depression that led to upsurge in support for the Nazis and the communists. And so German nationalists and Catholics and people generally on the right wing, they had really a catch-22. Do we support the Nazis or do we support this coalition of communists and social democrats? That's not really a choice that people generally find themselves wanting to make. But this leads to the rise of Adolf Hitler and the ascendancy of the Nazi Party, which was, to a large extent, caused by the Great Depression. Hitler and the Nazi Party were advocates of a variety of fascism. Now, fascism had already come into place in Italy under Benito Mussolini in the early 1920s. Now, Mussolini, even though he's lumped in with these totalitarians, now a totalitarian dictatorship, this is when the government seeks to control all aspects of public and private life. Mussolini's never really able to build something that we would properly call totalitarian, but Hitler and Stalin are going to be able to do that. Once Hitler took over in Germany, he began a rearmament policy, first in secret and then in plain sight. And of course, during the Depression, the Western European powers had other things to deal with besides worrying about Hitler. Now, there are some other people that are worth noting. We do want to note that the Spanish Civil War was happening, that Francisco Franco, even though we could argue about whether or not he was a fascist or a conservative authoritarian, he was receiving help from fascist Italy and from Nazi Germany, while Stalin and the Soviet Union were helping the other side in this conflict. So we want to distinguish briefly between left-wing totalitarianism and right-wing totalitarianism. Left-wing totalitarianism rejects any kind of social hierarchy. So this is where we're looking at Bolshevism and communism, whereas right-wing totalitarianism, we look at fascism and Nazism, they do endorse a social hierarchy, and while communists control the means of production directly, the means of production are in the hands of the government, right-wing totalitarianism uses existing corporations in order to produce things. So Mercedes and BMW, Hugo Boss, all of these companies were mobilized for production for the state, even though they remained in private hands. Now, also, when we look at the Nazis, we see these theories of racial superiority and bigotry toward Jews and homosexuals culminating in Kristallnacht and other tragedies that follow. So World War II was caused largely by Germany's expansion. Now, first of all, Germany went into the Rhineland, which was part of their country. Nobody really responded to that. Then Germany goes into Austria, which there wasn't a fight there. And Hitler said, I'm just unifying German-speaking peoples. He wanted to annex the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia, to which Britain and France said, okay, but don't invade Poland. Hitler invaded Poland. He was helped by the Soviet Union, probably the only time that Nazis and communists have gotten along together to divide Poland. So with the invasion of Poland, with Germany's blitzkrieg strategy, which employed fast-moving tanks in warfare, in contrast to the World War I trench warfare. Now, remember that Japan, we start to see that World War II is a global conflict. Japan is also expanding very rapidly with aggressive warfare, and Japan, Germany, and Italy form the Axis. We want to know about the leadership of Winston Churchill in World War II, this inspirational figure who rallied support in Britain for the resistance against Hitler and also had a hand in getting the United States. Even though the United States was not eager to get involved, he got the United States to help Britain through a number of programs before Pearl Harbor. And of course, once Pearl Harbor happened, that was it, and the United States was in the war. Now, we see that there are plenty of new military technologies, such as jet engines, the V-2 rockets that the Nazis launched at Britain, and then, of course, nuclear weapons when the United States detonated 2 nuclear bombs in Japan, which ended World War II. So with the defeat of Germany, the Allies discovered a level of barbarism that humans have not seen either before or sense, and the end result of Nazi persecutions against Jews and, of course, other groups such as homosexuals and other minorities such as the Roma. In terms of cultural, intellectual, and artistic developments during this time, remember that World War I shattered this belief in rationalism and progress. And so around the time of World War I, we see new art movements such as Dada or Dadaism, and it means exactly what it says, Dada. It just means nothing. And so you have this nothing art, such as you grab a urinal, you turn it on its side, and you sign it, and now that's art. It's kind of like anti-art as art, and it doesn't make any rational sense. It's not supposed to. And so we see this whole lost generation after World War I. The literature deals with this alienation, and of course other art movements such as Expressionism bring in this really poignant emotional experience, especially from veterans. Now, the world wars were also very instrumental in women's places in European society. So World War I, of course, brought a lot of women into the munitions factories. And during and after World War I, we see that most European nations gave women the right to vote. Now, it wasn't until after World War II, and we'll talk more about that later, where we see women wanting economic and social equality. That does not happen after World War I, but we do see the culmination of first wave feminism, which is the women's suffrage movement, comes to a close in the aftermath of World War I. So there you have Unit 8, which is largely defined by the world wars. Remember that World War I caused by these main causes: militarism, alliances, imperialism within Europe and outside of Europe, and nationalism. World War I being defined by these new technologies such as machine guns and tanks and this stalemated trench warfare. The Treaty of Versailles, which, although Woodrow Wilson tried to create a peace without victory, it ultimately failed, and Germany was saddled with war guilt and reparations, eventually having a hand in leading to the Great Depression and the rise of totalitarian regimes in Europe, whether that is right-wing totalitarianism such as the fascists and the Nazis, or the left-wing Bolshevik totalitarianism of the Soviet Union. And of course, this is leading us to World War II as we see aggressive warfare on the part of these authoritarian regimes. And the victory of the Allies in World War II, of course, ends what was the bloodiest period of world history, and really the last proper total war. Every war that's been fought since World War II has been on a smaller scale, with nuclear-capable countries tying a hand behind their back. So humanity has not seen this level of brutality ever since the end of World War II. And that almost brings us to a close, and we will soon get into contemporary Europe, and it is always a pleasure.